All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And this, folks, is a very special episode. Our researcher and producer, Jacob, recently wrote in this little prep doc that we have and said, you know, you're about to do your 400th episode. And look, here we are, folks. Can you believe it? 400 episodes. 400 is a lot of episodes. So we've got something special planned. But let me immediately say hello and congratulations to Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello and congratulations. I am tired.
I know. That's a lot. That's sort of mind-blowing a little bit.
It is mind-blowing, but when you do 3 a week, I suppose it adds up. And you know, I will say, like, it's really nice that we're doing this at this moment because we've hit this 400 mark. This is running on Thanksgiving, so hopefully, you know, folks are listening as you're cooking or whatever. It just feels like the vibes feel good. The other thing worth noting is that this 400th episode, a coincidence here, but it happens to be coming at this moment when we are starting the annual Radiotopia fundraiser. And so I think this is a chance to say congratulations and thank you to Radiotopia. And moreover, thank you to you listeners and anyone who's a member of Radiotopia. And I'm not going to do a big fundraiser pitch here, but I will say that, like, this show only comes together because of listener support. We are like a fully independent show. All 400 episodes that we've just made on our own. Radiotopia is there to, you know, promote the show, and we love being part of the network, but we are an independent, listener-supported show. We get to call the shots, and that is really valuable and only possible when people chip in. So we really appreciate that and encourage everyone listening, especially if you've listened to all 400 episodes, to become a member of Radiotopia.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, speaking of people who have maybe heard all 400 episodes, I mentioned our researcher Jacob Feldman before, and Jacob, along with our producer Brittany Brown, who edits the episodes, are probably the only other people in the world who've kind of like engaged with all 400 episodes. Jacob puts together these research docs that we use for every topic, goes really deep. We use them to kind of build the conversation. So who better, we thought, to have on to talk about 400 episodes than Jacob Feldman, who's here. Hello, Jacob.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well.
Yay.
I feel like this is kind of like a pay no attention to the man behind the curtain kind of situation here.
They're the great and powerful Oz.
They're going to be like, that's the guy that comes up with all these dates and facts. It's him.
You know, and I think we've talked about it on the show before, but, you know, we have like these group shared docs where we sort of just continually feeding them, a lot of them coming from listener suggestions, a lot of them coming from our research, a lot of them sort of working backwards from, I think we should find an excuse to talk about this, and then we sort of retrofit a date. But then eventually it all ends up in a sort of prep doc that we then use to get up on the story and figure out sort of the structure of the conversation. One thing, Jacob, if I can praise you a little bit, is I am very impressed by your work, but we share these docs whenever we have guests to say, hey, you know, here's what we're thinking of covering. And inevitably the guests are like, oh my God, this prep doc is amazing. And so, you know, you ingest an enormous amount of information and then you also sort of spit it back out into something that feels like a cohesive story for all of us to process. And
that's your guys' job too.
Well, a little bit too.
You turn it into a cohesive process, yeah.
So today, you know, let's do some thinking about the 400 episodes. So Jacob is going to rank all 400 episodes from least favorite to favorite.
God,
We'll be back in about an hour and a half.
We're going to rank the guests as well.
An hour and a half.
Oh,
so
God.
strap in, folks. No, Jacob. We are actually. This might be the first episode that doesn't have a prep doc because we just basically were like, we're going to let Jacob talk about what he's learned and what he's thought and so forth. So I suppose the floor is yours. What are we gonna do to mark 400?
Well, of course. Well, first off, I'll say, my job here is basically, as you mentioned, synthesizer. So I've boiled 400 episodes down to 4 lessons. So maybe you didn't join us for episode 1. Maybe you've missed 1 or 2, throughout the last, what's it been, 2.5 years.
Yeah.
So 4 lessons, you learn these. You'll know everything that I've learned doing this. And so should we get into them?
Let's go.
Yeah, please.
All right, fantastic. All right, so number 1, this is the most serious one, and they'll get lighter as they go. I remember, Kelly, we had a conversation after an episode recently where I asked, what happened to mob violence. I feel like so many times we do these stories of, attacks. We talk about nativists and Catholics or blacks and whites, these battles between, rival factions, I guess. And that's the one thing that going through this list of episodes is we've really been a nation of revolt since we talked about a slave revolt in 1712. So we're talking about over 300 years of revolt. And we all studied the big revolution, but we just talked about the Whiskey Rebellion that came 10 years after that. There was a series of border wars and smaller secessions in the early 1800s. Obviously, you get into the anti-Masonic battles that we've covered. Everybody knows those so well. And then, we've spoken plenty of times about Civil War, the run-up to it, what came after it, Reconstruction, the battles there. I could go on and on. The Red Summer, Marcus Garvey and the marches on Washington, the coups of the 30s, the long, hot summer, all of the battles in the 60s and 70s, all the way through to Occupy, Black Lives Matter, January 6th. And so I don't know, as I was going through this, I don't know if this gives me peace or comfort to think about the fact that we're always in this situation. But it's just, going through school, you learn about the Civil War. And what struck me was just that civility has actually been pretty rare in our nation's history.
I mean, wow, Jacob, I say this all the time. I'm like, we benchmark history with violence. Like, I feel like all the little dots on the historical timeline are wars and battles and rebellions. And that's even how we teach our classes. It's like from the slave trade to the Civil War, from Reconstruction to the present. Like, it's all about the Cold War or the war between the wars, or, that is how we understand change over time. Is through violence, which is, for better or worse, but that's sort of what it is.
Well, I think that it's also those kind of appeals to the golden eras of yesteryear, that any violence or disruption or unrest today is an aberration, is something that you hear a lot in politics. But I think that this show has been a very good reminder that the aberration are those periods of relative peace.
I feel like I've, rethought a little bit my understanding even of the Civil War. This understanding of it almost as kind of a cresting of little skirmishes, and especially, the run up to it and the way that it devolved, and it's just not as clean as the way we sort of have been taught.
Yes. So I just read Eric Foner wrote this article in 1972 about the causes of war. He could have wrote it yesterday because the article is 50 years old and yet it's still so spot on. And one of the lines in the article is that nothing in history is inevitable except the Civil War. like that's the one thing that people see is everything leads up to this moment. And I think that's, we don't treat a whole lot of other wars like that, but we do with the Civil War.
Jacob, have you noticed any, other than racism, are there any other patterns at the heart of kind of this history of violence and this history of diffuse skirmishing that you've noticed?
No, I think what jumped out to me was just how many different battle fronts these things are fought along. What we're talking about, we've covered a lot of the Union battles that get violent in various ways. We've talked about the battles over voting rights, whether that's along lines of race or gender. Obviously, you mentioned the regional conflict that bubbled up, and even in smaller forms, the border wars between Michigan and Ohio, or these small secessionary movements in Florida or Texas. And so that to me is what struck me is it just feels like there's a national spirit of fighting back, of recognizing that the flip side of freedom is, the freedom to say, I don't want to do this and I'm not going to do this and you're going to make me do this. And no matter what the issue is, whether it's, now it's a bunch of cultural issues too, that I think, feel like they spark violence just as much as things in the past. Should we move on to lesson number 2?
Yeah.
Okay. And this one's got a quiz component too for you guys.
Oh
gosh.
I've got my buzzer.
Don't worry, it's not
ready.
Nikki's the only one who's excited about it.
It's open response and it's subjective grading, so don't stress out too much about it. But lesson 2 is it's never too late to remember. I think the other thing I noticed, going back over episodes and listening to the way we start and end, a lot of them we talk about, this could be a book, this could be a movie, and it seems like, we're doing, I think, I'm going to ask you, but I think we're doing a better job of remembering some of these forgotten moments and recognizing that, like, once the history book is written, that doesn't mean you have to stop digging deeper or finding new things. And obviously the thread that jumps out to me most there is the Tulsa storyline, which I think has kind of reached the point of public understanding or conversation at the very least. But there are a few other episodes that I feel like are on that trajectory. The Move bombing is another one that I think people are talking about. The coup in Wilmington, North Carolina is one I see more and more now that we talked about it. The Tuskegee study is another one. And in each of those instances, it feels like there's like a modern, kind of reason to be talking about them in various ways. Seneca Village in New York is another one. But I'm curious for you guys, whether it's something we've talked about or not, what moments in history do you see getting its time in the sun upcoming? What do you think we're going to be reevaluating in these IP wars and media? What do you think is going to be, the breakout hit in the next couple of years?
That's a good question. Well, first on your larger observation, and I feel like I've learned that too. I've had that sense too, and I think there was an episode like, I don't know what it was, somewhere in the last 400 episodes, where I was testing out an idea on YouTube, and I basically invented historiography. Right? It was like, I didn't, but basically I've come to realize that the kind of history that we tell is as reflective of the moment that we're in right now as it is, anything else. And so, Jacob, to your point, I mean, some of the stories that you name checked as ones that feel like they're popping now because of the modern conversations, the modern lenses we're bringing to all this. In terms of your question, well, I don't know. Does anyone else have a nomination? I have a couple of things that come
I have a couple, but one of them, and I can't quite remember where it was, but there was a mutiny of mostly black soldiers after an explosion at a munitions plant.
Oh,
and
yeah.
That was so cinematic in my mind, and it hit so many themes that people are thinking about right now that I feel like that has to become a movie and a podcast series and all of these different things. And I think we've also done
that was Port Chicago.
Port Chicago, which is not in Chicago.
Which is in California, right? Yeah.
Yes,
right.
yes.
And also bringing more complexity to the story of women's suffrage. I think that's started to break through, especially with the new Broadway play Suffs, which really, in a kind of didactic way, brings the tensions within the suffrage movement to the fore. That feels like something that is going to continue to get a lot of attention, especially as women become more prominent actors in U.S. politics.
For me, I think it's the U.S. invasion of Haiti, the U.S. invasion and occupation. Because I think about how the New York Times did this whole thing on Haiti not too long ago. I think about the assassination of their president and the political fallout that they're dealing with right now. So much of this seems so current, so resonant, that I come back to that a lot.
Yeah. There was this sort of a joke at 30 for 30, but it was like, we can just take whatever year it is now and then subtract 15 and we'll find 3 stories to do there. Because it's like, that's the sort of nostalgia clock, right? It's like how 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And actually, Jacob, you mentioned the IP wars, and it's actually funny because I think people are mining more and more recent past because the 15 years ago has been totally picked over. But to offer an example that's a little more recent, though, and I've thought about this and even tried to kind of cook things up or whatever. But I feel like Occupy needs a big, big conversation.
Totally.
And I think of
absolutely.
it's just so fascinating, and I'm sitting on a pitch deck. If anyone out there wants the IP, be in touch. But no, I mean, I think there's a big series to be done there, and a big sort of reckoning of that, especially as something that planted. I think that introduced language that still kind of defines our conversation now of a basic language of inequality. And like I think if you can say here was a movement that at some basic level taught Americans how to talk about the 1%. That's a very successful movement in my mind, right? Not to mention it maybe planted the seeds for Bernie Sanders, and so anyway, that might be my my nomination. We've done one episode on Occupy, right?
At least one, yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a fantastic one. I know. I think they're reviving the play about Leo Frank. I think on Broadway.
Oh,
that would be
yes.
one I would buy stock in terms of historical IP, I guess. Is it Calumet, Christmas Tragedy? I think. These are just stories that stick with me, and in that sense, I could imagine being dramatized. I think you mentioned Haiti. I think Puerto Rico is another one. I think going back to our episode there about kind of the ways rebellions, going back to that point, have been put down there and things like that. Johnstown flood is another one, but I think there's just the molasses flood here in Boston.
Flood?
Yes, absolutely. Was on the list here as well. Okay.
Well, there's a Woody Guthrie song about the Calumet tragedy. I don't think that counts, so you can do more. But also, and actually, another rubric I'm thinking by which we could measure this is by emails that we get. Sometimes emails saying, I can't believe you didn't talk about this part of the story and this part of the story and this part of the story. And I do seem to remember, I can't call them up right now, but I do seem to remember in the wake of that one that you mentioned, Nikki, about Port Chicago, we got a lot of folks saying, oh, there's all these other layers to that story too. So that's another way to figure out.
Yeah, Port Chicago is a fantastic pick. It's a great name for a movie. Just Port Chicago just kind of sells itself. And then the drama, the World War II aspects, I think there's a lot there. And then the side note to that lesson is just that we've covered a lot of plaques on this show, and my advice to everybody is just always read the plaque. Especially here, I'm based in Boston. There's a ton of fantastic illuminating plaques. I think my favorite is maybe the Boston Corbett Memorial that we talked about. The time a Boy Scout troop erected a memorial to the guy who killed Lincoln, maybe, depending on, we don't really exactly know what happened to him, but in the middle of Kansas. Yes, Concordia, Kansas. But that's my favorite.
And it had two guns on the top of it, and then 10 years later, someone stole the guns, but the memorial is still there. Yes.
Exactly. So I always read the plaque.
All right, folks, that brings us to the end of this episode. We will be back next episode with part 2 of Jacob's lessons from 400 episodes of This Day in Esoteric Political History. We'll talk a little bit about what we've learned makes for interesting and historically significant moments, and a little bit about empathy and trying to really understand a story in the context of its time. But for now, we'll leave it there, and I'll say happy Thanksgiving to all of you. And thanks again to all of you who have been listening all along the way. And it is the Radiotopia fundraiser, so thanks to all of you who support Radiotopia in whatever way you can, either financially or just by spreading the word about this show. Whatever you can do, it really helps. There is a link in the show notes if you would like to become a member of Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.